My name is Manfred Helber. I'm a Microsoft Most Valuable Professional in the category Cloud and Data Center. Azure Backup and Azure Site Recovery are independent services. You can decide only to use Azure Backup, you can decide only to use Azure Site Recovery, or you can decide to use both together. Let's first start with Azure Backup. Azure Backup is a very powerful service that provides Azure-based backup services for your on-premises and your cloud infrastructure. So you don't need to differentiate between these two platforms, and as we have learned in previous modules, Azure Stack HCI runs on premises, but from the platform perspective, it's Microsoft Azure. So regarding the agents we install, we are using the on-premises agents for Azure Stack HCI. These are the same or the similar agents we use for Windows Server workloads we will back up to Azure. We will focus on the Azure Stack HCI nodes and the Azure Stack HCI workload. But for sure, you can also use Azure Backup to back up your domain controllers, to back up your file servers, your management hosts. Also, your clients can be backupped. We have a backup agent to provide this backup for our on-premises infrastructure. We will use the Azure Backup agent. There's also an Azure Backup server. If you have a larger infrastructure with additional backup needs, it could be an interesting option to use this Azure Backup server. The Azure Backup server is a software installation. It's based on the well-known System Center Data Protection Manager technology. You don't have to buy any additional license. So Azure Backup, even if you are using the Azure Backup server, works completely consumption-based. We will talk about the costs in a few minutes. And the Azure Backup service provides a central management. There's a central backup portal where we have all the monitoring, all the control, all the data resiliency and retention policies. And we will use Windows Admin Center for managing Azure Backup. Because as we have seen in previous modules, for example, for Azure Monitor, we have an easy implementation in the Windows Admin Center to have a very easy deployment of Azure Backup for our on-premises infrastructure. When we focus on the on-premises data, we can back up files, we can back up folders, we can back up the system state. Everything is transferred in a secure way to our Azure Backup Recovery Services Vault. So the target to success is to build this Azure Backup Recovery Services Vault and to store the data there. For the backup data in this Azure offsite location, we have different redundancy options. Local redundancy means this is stored with a redundancy in one data center. With geo redundancy, we have stored the backup data in two Azure Backup data centers in two Azure locations. I receive often questions from customers that are afraid that maybe their amount of data they want to back up is too large for the internet connectivity. So they are afraid they will not be able to transfer all their data through their internet connection. Because in Germany, we have the situation that we're typically using asynchronous internet connectivity. So you usually have a very powerful downstream internet, but you have limited upload speed. And for this situation, Microsoft provides an offline backup option. With the offline backup option, you are able to back up your data locally to a staging location. There are different types. This can be disks, this can be servers, this can be boxes. These offline staging locations are transferred via parcel service to an Azure backup location where this backup device is connected and where you can restore the data to your Azure blob storage to bring it to the Azure Backup service. So even this process is available, but if you need an offline backup with an offline on-premises staging, you cannot configure this in the Windows Admin Center. In this scenario, you have to use the Windows Admin Portal and the full-featured Azure Backup agent. When we are talking about the costs for Azure Backup, important is to know that it's consumption-based. So we do not need any reservations. We don't have any upfront costs there. We only pay for what we consume. We have two components for the Azure Backup pricing. One component is the instance size. An instance is a physical server or a virtual machine. And we have costs for the storage consumption. So the amount of data we store in the Azure Data Center. For the instances, we have the small instance. The small instance could be a virtual machine with less than 50 gigabytes to back up. For such a small instance, we have the base fee per instance of $5 and additionally the storage consumption. The storage consumption is a very small amount, but it's a little bit difficult to calculate it via this link, microsoft.com, ENUS pricing details backup. You can calculate this exactly because there are different prices depending if you are using local redundancy for your storage or geo redundancy. This is the reason why you always should use the price calculator to get a detailed price about this. If my virtual machine consumes 10 gigabyte in the backup size, it's $5 per storage. When it's 15 gigabytes, it's $5 per storage. When it's 30 gigabytes, it's $5 per plus storage. Even if it's 50 gigabyte, it's $5 per storage. If we have 50 gigabyte plus, then we have this default instance size with a base fee of $10 plus storage consumption. And this $10 is the base fee for every physical or virtual machine with a backup size between 50 gigabytes and 500 gigabytes. When the instance is larger than 500 gigabytes, we have an increment for the base fee for each 500 gigabytes by $10. So we have this component base fee per instance, depending on the size. There we have a range where this fee is for, and always additionally the storage consumption. This price depends on the redundancy level I've selected. When we have a look at the Azure Backup deployment workflow, we can see if we would do it via the Azure portal, there are many steps here. First, we need an Azure subscription. We already have this Azure subscription because we have Azure Stack HCI, and this Azure Stack HCI is registered in Azure. Then we have a recovery services vault we have to create there. Then we need to download the vault credential file and the backup agent to the machine that has to be backed. Windows Workstation or server. Can be Windows 10 or 11 Pro or Enterprise or a Windows server. Then we have to install the Azure Backup agent on the machine, and we have to register this backup agent in the Recovery Services Vault with the vault credentials. Then we can start to back up folders, files, also system state to the Azure Recovery Services Vault. And what we will see in the live demo is that we can configure all these steps within a few clicks in Windows Admin Center. So let's switch to our live demo environment. You already have seen this cluster in several previous live demos. And for Azure Backup, we are not focused on the cluster itself because we are backing up instances. Regarding Azure Backup, the cluster is not an instance. The instances are the servers and the virtual machines. Let's try Azure Backup for our Azure Stack HCI nodes. I will select the first one, the Azure Stack HCI node 01. And I will switch to the Azure Hybrid Center. And in the Azure Hybrid Center, I can configure Azure Backup. If we don't want to back up your Azure Stack HCI nodes because you think they are redundant, then you're right. We have several of them. The data is redundant. In the worst case, we could reinstall a node. Then you can also focus on the virtual machine workload. So it's only an example how to back up a node. It would be the same steps to back up a virtual machine, but then we have to connect to the virtual machine and start the process there. For sure, we can also manage the virtual machine in Windows Admin Center. So let's configure the Azure Backup for this machine. So I will choose the Azure Backup and click on Setup. Here I get a welcome message with an information how much will it cost. We have this always in the hybrid services, and I can click on Setup Azure Backup. Please remember, in our module about registering Azure Stack HCI in Microsoft Azure and configuring Azure Arc, we already onboarded this Windows Admin Center installation here to my Azure subscription. This means I have already information here about logging into the Microsoft portal, and now I can start with step 2, set up Azure Backup. If I didn't configure the Azure connectivity till now, maybe you remember, then we have limitations. We cannot create any new virtual machines on Azure Stack HCI till we are connected to Azure. Till we are connected to Azure for the first time. If you have been connected to Azure, you have then a disconnectivity for maximum 30 days. You will still be able to also create new virtual machines, to use Azure benefits and so on. But we need a connectivity to Microsoft Azure minimum once every 30 days. So if we haven't configured the connectivity of the Windows Admin Center to Azure, I have to start with step 1 and onboard Windows Admin Center. If you want to review these steps, please have a look at the video model about registering Azure Stack HCI with Azure and configuring Azure Arc. There you have a detailed video with the steps to configure this integration. So let's see the setup Azure Backup. Let's show the details. So it's a little bit hidden here. And I want to use my Azure sponsorship for configuring Azure Backup. And we can see here are already several recovery services vaults. I can use an existing or I can use a new one. If you start new with Windows Admin Center in a new Azure subscription, you will see here the Windows Admin Center Vault 1. So you don't have this typical step, create new resource group or create something new here for the vault. It recommends you to use an existing vault or create this new one where the name is already here in there. Our resource group, please remember, we created the Azure Stack HCI resource group in a previous step. You can see here are a lot of resource groups I have from different demos here. And we have this Azure Stack HCI resource group I can select. So a resource group is something like, let's say, not in technical words, but for easier understanding, something like a container. Things that belong together can be put in this container, not a container in terms of virtualization, but in bringing things together. A container, a folder, an object where you can put all the resources that belong together. And for my Azure Stack HCI demo here, I'm using always this Azure Stack HCI resource group we configured in a previous video module when we onboarded Windows Admin Center and Azure Stack HCI to Microsoft Azure. The location is not the location I will use. I will use West Europe here. You can choose whichever location you prefer. So let's see the Europe West or West Europe. Sometimes it's first the direction and then the continent and then vice versa. So West Europe. Okay. Then select the backup items to schedule. I want to back up the system state, yes, and also the drive C. I want to have a full backup of this machine. Selected, roughly calculated to size below, will be something like 25 gigabytes. Remember the prices. This is the small instance with the $5 space fee and with additional costs for the storage consumption. Via this link, I can exactly calculate what this will cost. How long will I retain the data of this backup? With an how long will I retain the file and folders, and how long will I retain the system state that's part of the backup? So now I need an encryption path phrase. I will use one here. Typo in there. And I have to repeat this one. Now I can, this path phrase must be minimum 16 characters, and then I can apply these settings. What happens? Remember these steps on the slide. The recovery services vault is created. The backup agent is deployed. Let's have a look at the installed apps on this machine here. In the Windows Admin Center, I have to re-authenticate here. I will open a new tab while the setup agent is deployed. Let's have a look at the installed apps on this machine. We are on the node 01. In the installed apps, here we can see the dependency agent, the Azure Connected Machine agent, Microsoft Monitoring agent. Remember the previous videos, the Azure Connected Machine agent was deployed when we configured Azure Arc. The dependency agent and the Microsoft Monitoring agent were deployed when we configured Azure Monitor. And in a few minutes, we will see a new agent for Azure Backup. We have seen this on the slide. So we have information here, setting up Azure Backup. Please do not close this tab. This is the reason why I opened a new one. And when we go back to the presentation and the steps, we can see the recovery services vault. Step 1 is created by this wizard. I don't have to connect to the Azure portal and do this manually. Actually, the backup agent is downloaded together with the vault data. This happens actually. And then the backup agent is installed and registered. So I save a lot of time and steps I would have to configure manually if I would not use Windows Admin Center to configure this here. Important is to keep in mind that the deployment and configuration of this Azure Backup is provided for the node 01. If you also want to enable the node 02, so Azure Stack HCI 02, our second node, you have to do this manually there. An alternate way would be to configure Azure Backup via Azure Arc from the Azure portal. This would be the recommended way if you have a huge amount of backup targets to configure and to set up. This process that actually runs here does not back up the files, provides a schedule. If we want to have an initial manual backup, then we have to trigger this when Azure Backup is configured. Now it's finished. Let's have a look at this configuration here. We have our recovery services vault, VAC Vault 6. We have our backup retention policy that's configured. I have my information about the subscription ID. I have no jobs, no recovery points, nothing failed, nothing is running. Let's have a look at the target server. The target server now has an additional installation of the Microsoft Azure Recovery Services Agent, and we have an update for the Microsoft Azure Recovery Services Agent. So these two entries belong together. And I explained in several previous modules that Windows Admin Center doesn't install any agents on the target machine, so on the Azure Stack HCI nodes, but the Azure Hybrid Services, several of them install an agent to have the connectivity between this on-premises and the cloud-based technologies, even if Windows Admin Center is not running there. So let's start the backup here. I could wait based on the backup policy. Next schedule is on 4th of April at 4 p.m. But I want to have an backup now. I can choose here backup now to initiate and backup for my environment for files and folders and or system state. I will start with the system state and back up the system state here for exactly this machine. Remember, we have this notification here where we can get detailed information about the process. So the backup has started, the system state, the job has started, and now we can wait till the backup is finished. We have actually one job running. We could also use the time to use a second tab here to switch to Windows Admin Center, go to the second node, and to configure Azure Backup there. I explained this to you. I have to authenticate here again and use credentials for all connections. Credentials didn't work. Yeah. Now I know what went wrong. My browser asked me if I want to store new credentials. These were the credentials of the backup vault. These are not the credentials I use to connect to the server. So the same steps here. I will go to the Azure Hybrid Center. I will select the server here and the Azure Backup. So today this is not available as a cluster level configuration. Maybe this will change somewhere in the future, but today this is server level. So I choose Azure Backup, go to Setup. Also Azure Arc is on server level, but as we have seen in the live demo about onboarding Azure Arc in a previous module, this is configured on the cluster level and distributed to all the nodes. So let's set up Azure Arc. Set up Azure Backup. The similar steps, it's already connected. Now I will choose the sponsorship and I will choose the vault number 6. I can use the same vault. Not every server needs its own vault. It makes sense to maybe have a vault for infrastructure and maybe have a vault for critical data and things like this, but it's not necessary to have a vault for every single server. So I have the encryption path for us here. And now I can also apply and set up Azure Backup for this system here, for this second node in the configuration. The first one, we have one job. This job is in progress. When I have a look at the recovery points, I can see actually no records are found. In the jobs, I can see there's a system state backup. Azure Backup is running pre-checks before taking system state backup. So actually, this pre-checks are running. The second server is deploying. So you can work perfectly in parallel with the Azure Backup and the Windows Admin Center if you use several additional tabs. So we will jump a little bit forward in this live demo. So I will pause the recording and come back to the live demo environment when the backup has finished. Now the backup has finished on both servers. I have also triggered an file backup and a system state on both machines. So we have this complete backup finished on both machines. So let's check it on our first node where we started with the Azure Backup journey. Now I can see I have two successful jobs. If one would fail or we would have warnings, we can see this here. And if there's a job in progress, I have also the information here. Actually, no job is in progress. I have recovery points, one for files and folders and one for system state. If you evaluated Azure Backup a few years ago, maybe you are still on the point where you have the information that system state cannot be backed up with Azure Backup. We have this functionally since 2 years, I think so, in Azure Backup already. So the system state of a running machine can completely be backed. For sure, I can control here, backup no, stop backup, refresh, delete backup data. Maybe this is important if you had an additional manual backup that overconsumes your planned budget. I have the recovery points I can see here now. I have the system state, I have the C drive, and I have the jobs, the past jobs. I have here alert and notifications I can configure via the Azure portal. So this button here, alerts and notifications, is again a direct link to the Azure portal where I can see if there was anything wrong with the Azure Backup here. And in the recovery points, I can also select one of these points or see the points, can refresh if there is missing information. And here's a button to recover data. For recovering the data, I have different ways how to act depending on if I'm using the server where I started the backup. So if the server is still there and I only lost data, it's a different way how to recover compared to the situation when I lost the server completely and I have to rebuild the server completely. I have a step-by-step guide here how to prepare this backup and how to prepare this recovery. So this was a live demo about configuring Azure Backup and the different options in Windows Admin Center. So now let's continue with the Azure Site Recovery, because as I mentioned in the live demo at the end, Azure Backup, when I back up the data, I can restore the data from Azure Backup. For sure, I can restore it on the initial host, I can restore it on a different host, but with Azure Backup, I will bring the data to Azure and back to my on-premises systems if I want to recover something. With the Azure Site Recovery, the idea is to also bring data to Azure, to the Azure Site Recovery Service, but with the capability to fail over to Azure if I have an outage on premises. So with Azure Site Recovery, the Azure Data Center is not only my backup location, but it's also my failover data center for the situation of an outage of my Hyper-V host servers, my Azure Stack HCI nodes, my cluster here. To provide Azure Site Recovery, we have the Microsoft Site Recovery Services agent. Azure Site Recovery is available for virtual machines, for physical Windows machines, for physical Linux machines. It's available for VMware environments, and for sure for Azure Stack HCI. So Azure Stack HCI is the platform we will use for the Azure Site Recovery demo. Before we start with the demo, it's also important to understand the costs for Azure Site Recovery. Azure Site Recovery knows two configuration options. One of the configuration options means Azure Site Recovery provides a redundant replication of the machine in the Azure Data Center. The other Azure Site Recovery option provides a redundant replication of a virtual machine or an environment in a second customer-owned location, not in Azure, but in a customer-owned location. So Azure Site Recovery can also be used to replicate here to a second location and to provide the functionality here for the protected workload, the protected VMs. For sure, that is a difference in pricing. When we back up or if we replicate our workload to Azure with the capability to switch to the Azure data center if something goes wrong in the on-premises data center, I have costs of $25 per month per protected instance. We don't have the situation we had in Azure Backup that the instance price increases when the machine is larger. So we only look at the instances, number of VMs, number of physical servers, number of machines protected by Azure Site Recovery. Additionally to this $25, we have additional costs if we switch the workload to the Azure data center. So let's imagine we have an outage on premises and we switch our workload to Microsoft Azure and we start the virtual machines there. Then we pay the pay-per-use price we have for the virtual machine workload in the Azure data centers. Also additionally is the used storage capacity. It's similar to what we have seen in Azure Backup. So we will consume storage in Azure, and the storage capacity is not included in this $25. Because imagine you replicate a huge terabyte amount of data, for sure you have an additional price for this. Storage costs are very low in Azure, so it's very affordable to have storage in Azure, but for sure we also have to calculate this. If we replicate in another customer-owned site, we will not cover this in the live demo, but it's possible from the technical perspective. Then we will have a price of $16 per month per instance for this protection of the instance in another customer site. And for sure, there we don't have any additional costs for storage in Azure because there we need the storage at the second customer site. Detailed pricing is available via the shown link. There you also can calculate your scenario. And for sure, you can select the protection for VMs on the VM level. So if you have 100 VMs, it's not needed to replicate all the VMs to Azure. You can decide for your most important VMs. So let's have a look at the configuration of the Azure Site Recovery. Azure Site Recovery is one of these great hybrid services we can also address from the cluster level. So I will connect to my Azure Stack HCI cluster. And on this Azure Stack HCI cluster, I will switch to the virtual machines tool. You remember in a previous video module, we created virtual machines, and I want to have a look at these virtual machines, but for now I have to refresh my Windows Admin Center to receive the full tools list. Now it's there, and I can see here I have the volumes and I have the virtual machines. Let's connect to the virtual machines. And when this page is completely loaded, I can see here, help protect your VMs from disaster by using Azure Site Recovery. Set up now. So it's a direct information where Microsoft says, okay, you have local running virtual machines. They are high available in an Azure Stack HCI cluster. But if you want to have geo-redundancy in an offsite location, it might be a good idea to set up Azure Site Recovery. We can click on this link here, Set Up Now. Set up now the Azure Site Recovery. Here we can see I am signed in with my user. To remember this, we configured this in the module onboarding Azure Stack HCI to Azure and Azure Arc. So this wizard will install the site recovery provider on the target hosts. We'll check the target hosts when this process has finished. I have my subscription. I will select another one, the Azure sponsorship subscription here. I will not create a new resource group, but I will use an existing. I will use the existing Azure Stack HCI resource group. I already explained this. A resource group is comparable to a folder or to a container where we put different things together. So I created an Azure Stack HCI resource group. You can see here I have a lot of manually created resource groups and a lot of automatically created resource groups. I want to have a recovery services vault. I could use my existing one, the Windows Admin Center vault number 6, or I could create a new one. For example, the Windows Admin Center Azure Site Recovery 01 here, for example. I could choose for West Europe or your preferred region. I have again the information that I can check the costs, and I have the information after we notify you, setup is finished. This can take up to 10 minutes. Return to virtual machines and select which VM you want to protect. So this step we are executing now here is to onboard the nodes in the cluster itself. The second step is to select Azure Site Recovery or to configure Azure Site Recovery for a specific VM. So let's set up the Azure Site Recovery service. Here you can see the setting up host with Azure Site Recovery is actually running. VM protection setup is in progress. Let's check one of the nodes. We have here in the node number 2. Let's go to the installed apps. If there something changes, we have the dependency agent, the update for Microsoft Azure Recovery Services agent and the Azure Recovery Services agent, the connected machine agent for Azure Arc and the monitoring agent for Azure Monitoring we configured in previous labs. And now the information was it will take up to 10 minutes, and I will pause the recording and then come back to the video to save you time in watching this. If you configure it in a physical or virtual environment in your lab, you should plan with this 10 to 15 laps till the configuration has finished. So the installation of Azure Site Recovery now has finished. Let's check my activity log, and we can see here I had first an error here setting up host with Azure Site Recovery. This can happen when you are configuring hybrid services, that there are some blockers that the script maybe blocks the next step in the execution. If you have this situation, the recommendation is to execute the steps again. I did exactly this, and maybe the recovery services vault was not ready when it tried to deploy the agents and so on, because when I look at the details here, I can see here it was not possible to deploy the agents on the two nodes. And the recommendation was to manually install the recovery services agent. Yes, this is possible, but this is a lot of work. So I decided only to click again on Configure Azure Site Recovery here. And now you can see it finished successfully. I can see now the installed apps on the two nodes. On both nodes, I have the Azure Site Recovery Provider. It's a new agent that's provided here, and you can see we will receive a lot of agent. Maybe someone in the future. This is nothing that it's announced, but maybe will someone see a universal agent, because when we think about the capabilities today and the planned capabilities for Azure Arc, then this could be such an universal agent maybe in the future. Again, nothing is announced in this direction. Today we have for this individual hybrid services, the individual agents, and for sure we also have this on the first node. If we have a 3, 4, 5 node cluster, we have this on every node in the cluster. Now let's go back to the virtual machines list, because there was the information when I configured Azure Site Recovery that after the onboarding to Azure Site Recovery, now I can select individual virtual machines. So let's, for example, take this virtual machine here, and in Manage, I now can configure replicate using Azure Site Recovery. So I can now replicate this machine to Azure. I will select the Azure sponsorship. The resource group is an existing. The recovery services vault should be a new one here in this configuration. I will use this one. Usually I should also see the list of the existing ones, but the recommendation is to have for the VM level a new one here. Let's create the recovery services vault 02 because the 01 already exists. And we have the West Europe here. So resource group, use existing, create new, and now we will set up the site recovery for this single virtual machine. For sure, we can also configure the site recovery for several machines in our cluster. As I mentioned, we can decide this on the VM level. So now we have protected this specific virtual machine 01 via Azure Site Recovery. And for sure, we can configure the protection for additional virtual machines if we need it there. So in this module, you have seen the configuration of Azure Backup for the two Azure Stack HCI hosts in our demo cluster. I also mentioned you can configure Azure Backup for virtual machines, for some or all of the virtual machines. And we have seen how to configure Azure Site Recovery on the cluster level for the cluster and on the level of a virtual machine. It will need about 15 to 30 minutes to enable this, for sure, depending on your storage amount, because this has to be replicated to Azure. If you have a huge virtual machine and a limited internet connectivity, this will need more time.